It was late afternoon on November 17, 2001, when the Kansas sky began to lose its pale autumn light, turning copper at the horizon as the cold wind rolled across flat fields. Michael Foster drove the family sedan along the endless stretch of I-70 eyes on the rearview mirror as the kids in the back seat squabbled over a coloring book. Sarah sat in the passenger seat cradling a coffee cup from the last gas station stop, watching the barbed wire fences blur past. The family was on their way home from visiting Sarah's sister in Colorado, but the road felt longer than expected. Tired and hungry, they saw the glowing neon sign for May's Junction, a roadside diner that promised homemade pies and warm meals. The decision was made quickly. Michael flicked on the turn signal and the car bumped over the gravel lot to rest beside two semis. They climbed out, stretching stiff limbs in the chill air. Inside May's Junction, everything smelled of bacon grease and brewed coffee. A big clock ticked on the wall above the pie case. The waitress behind the counter gave a tired smile as she handed them menus that were stained at the corners, the plastic covers cracked from years of use. Emma and Ben, just 9 and 6, bounced on the padded booth arguing about which milkshake flavor to get. Michael rubbed his temples and muttered about the drive, while Sarah tried to keep the peace with forced cheerfulness. Outside the window, dusk swallowed the fields, turning them into shifting shadows. The air felt heavy, like a storm was waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. It was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of stop any family might make on any road trip. That made what came next even worse. Their food arrived on chipped plates. Burgers with greasy fries, a small grilled cheese cut diagonally for Ben Emma's chocolate milkshake sweating onto the table. They ate in relative peace, while the waitress refilled coffee cups for the handful of truckers and locals at the counter. There was the muffled hum of the old jukebox skipping over a Willie Nelson song. It was so perfectly normal that no one noticed when Sarah stood and went to the restroom with Emma. Michael stayed with Ben, cutting his sandwich into smaller pieces, trying not to lose patience as Ben whined about the crust. The clock ticked on, a ceiling fan squeaked with every slow turn. At that exact moment, no one in the diner realized they were witnessing the last calm moments of a family who would soon simply not exist. Outside the diner, the wind picked up. Dust swirled under the single lamppost that lit the cracked pavement. A semi rumbled to life and growled off into the dark. When the door opened with its tinny bell, the air turned colder inside. The waitress glanced up from her check pad, watching two figures in jackets step inside. No one really noticed them in detail. Later, the staff could not even agree on hair color or height. These small details would haunt them all. Back at the booth, Michael glanced toward the bathroom hallway, checking the time, wondering why Sarah and Emma were taking so long. Ben slurped his milkshake loudly. Another minute passed. Michael felt something twist in his stomach. He decided to stand up to go check, but then paused as the door swung open again and a gust of wind made the cheap blinds rattle. The security camera in May's Junction was old, with the grainy black and white footage stored on VHS tapes in the manager's back office. At that moment, the lens captured the booth where the Foster family sat, but no one would check that tape for years. On the floor beside the table, Sarah's worn brown purse sat propped against the vinyl seat. The camera caught Michael leaning back, tapping the table in irritation, then standing up fully. Ben's eyes tracked him, half curious, half nervous. The tape would later show the boy swinging his legs under the table, making a steady rhythm against the squeaky booth. As then, there was the moment when Michael appeared to look at someone off camera and nod once stiffly. Ben slid out of the booth, following his dad with a trust only 6-year-olds have. In the kitchen, the cook shouted an order up, grease popping on the grill. The door to the bathroom swung on rusty hinges. Sarah's voice was muffled as she urged Emma to hurry, washing her hands, the girl whining about soap in her eyes. The sound of the faucet ran too long. Water pooled under the door, just a thin line soaking into the worn linoleum. No one noticed. The other customers kept eating. Outside, the wind rattled the old neon sign until one of the letters blinked out. The parking lot seemed deserted, except for their car engine off, headlights dead. The keys were in the ignition, turned halfway radio, humming static. No one saw them leave. No one noticed the door open or shut in those final moments. It was like they had simply stopped existing. When the waitress came to bus the table 20 minutes later, she frowned at the half-eaten fries, the sweating milkshake glass. She found Sarah's purse on the seat, rummaged inside for a wallet or ID to see if they were regulars she should know. The cash was gone, but the phone was inside dead battery. She looked around, calling a tentative greeting into the quiet diner. The cook shrugged when she asked if he had seen them leave. The other customers barely glanced up. It had been busy enough that no one paid them much attention. The waitress felt a chill work up her spine for no reason she could name. She left the purse on the counter and went back to her work, shaking her head at how some people could be so rude as to dine and dash. Outside, the Kansas night pressed in tight, the fields now black and infinite. The wind howled against the glass, shaking the door in its frame. In the parking lot, their car sat like a monument to something terrible. Its doors locked, but with keys waiting inside headlights dead. No footprints showed in the gravel lot beyond where the semi had left its tracks. No tire marks that did not belong to locals or delivery drivers. When the county sheriff arrived 2 hours later, summoned by the panicked owner of May's Junction, he stood with his boots crunching in the gravel and looked at that locked car. He felt something dark stir in his gut. The deputies turned on their flashlights beams, cutting through the dark, searching the endless fields for any sign of life. They found nothing. By dawn, the story had begun to spread. Local radio announced an urgent bulletin for anyone traveling I-70 to watch for the missing family of 4. Flyers were printed by noon, taped to gas station windows and the doors of other diners. Truckers shared their descriptions on CB radios, listening for any word on Emma and Ben's small faces. Reporters snapped photos of the diner, the abandoned car. Michael and Sarah's parents drove hundreds of miles to answer questions at the sheriff's office, their eyes hollow. The waitress who served them quit 2 days later, unable to sleep, dreaming of their half-eaten burgers and the untouched pie that sat in the display case for days before someone finally threw it away. No one could explain it. They had simply vanished. The sheriff sat in his office 2 days after the Foster family vanished, rubbing his eyes as the thin gray light of morning leaked through dirty blinds. On his cluttered desk sat a growing stack of missing person reports, witness statements, and scrawled notes with question marks in the margins. Deputies had canvassed May's Junction again and again, walking through the scuffed linoleum floors of the diner, asking the tired-eyed staff to remember every detail of that night. The waitress insisted she saw Michael looking frustrated as he left the booth with his son trailing behind him, but she could not remember anyone else standing close enough to hear their words. Her voice trembled as she spoke of Sarah's forgotten purse, of the kids' abandoned milkshakes forming sticky rings on the table. Outside the diner, the family car sat in the lot for days, locked with the keys inside and nothing touched. The sheriff had towed it away eventually, but the empty back seat and worn floor mats offered nothing but silent accusation. Deputies fanned out into the flat Kansas fields that surrounded May's Junction, pushing through dead grass and poking at frozen earth with metal rods in search of disturbed soil. Volunteers from local churches joined in with heavy boots and flashlights, forming grim lines at dawn that stretched toward the horizon. Helicopters hovered over the landscape blades, chopping the cold air as pilots scanned for any sign of movement or bright color against the dull brown. Nothing emerged. Canine teams sniffed around the parking lot and diner entrance, but lost the trail within yards, tails drooping with frustration. The wind erased everything, flattening grass and blowing away any evidence that might have clung to tire tracks or footprints in the gravel. The sheriff called off the dogs and watched them load back into battered trucks, shaking his head at how quickly the wide-open land could swallow secrets. State investigators arrived days later with quiet efficiency, rolling up in unmarked cars and setting up in the back room of the sheriff's office. They unfolded maps on battered tables marking known addresses and travel routes with neon sticky notes, hoping to find patterns that might explain the disappearance. Truck stop logs were pulled and checked against credit card records, looking for any sign the Fosters had continued their journey under duress. No one had used Sarah's bank cards, and Michael's last known purchase was a full tank of gas in Colorado the day before. Surveillance tapes from nearby gas stations were reviewed frame by frame by tired eyes growing red with the glow of static lines. No sign of them emerged beyond the grainy footage of them filling up and smiling at the kids in the back seat. Each new reel delivered only disappointment. Local residents were questioned their polite friendliness, giving way to defensive irritation as the days passed with no answers. Farmers and pickup trucks leaned against fences, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all, muttering about how no one could just vanish without a trace in Kansas. Old men at diner counters debated theories, their voices rising as they speculated about hitchhikers, drifters, or someone who knew the family well enough to lure them away. One woman claimed she'd seen a strange vehicle parked near the diner that night, but her description changed with every telling. She was sure it had out-of-state plates, then thought it might have been local. It was red or blue or maybe dark green. Investigators eventually stopped writing her statements down. Among the stack of reports, one stood out for its oddness. A long-haul trucker passing through had said he saw the family on the shoulder of a county road, the kids standing close to Sarah, while Michael spoke to someone leaning out of a pickup. The problem was, he could not give a time, only that it was dark and he was fighting fatigue. He thought the man in the pickup wore a hat, but could not recall a badge or uniform. When pressed for details, he grew agitated and defensive, eventually storming out of the station in frustration. Deputies followed up on every pickup owner they could find within 50 miles, but none matched any description well enough to justify a warrant. The lead faded like breath on cold glass. Other calls came in from all over the region. A woman in Missouri was certain she saw the family at a rest stop bathroom. A clerk in Oklahoma swore they bought snacks at his gas station the next day. A man in Nebraska insisted he saw them huddled in the back seat of a car on a rainy night at a traffic light. Each sighting was vague, contradictory, and unverified. Investigators drove hundreds of miles to follow up, only to find nothing but confusion and frustration waiting. Sarah's family sat through hours of questioning, their voices cracking with emotion as they denied any knowledge of debts or enemies. Michael's brother traveled from Wyoming, red-eyed and unshaven, swearing Michael would never abandon his family or run off without telling someone. The faces of Emma and Ben appeared on local news, small smiles and school portraits, eyes that seemed to plead silently with the viewer for help. As weeks turned into months, the tone of the investigation changed. The case file grew fat with dead ends notes scrawled in the margins in pencil that smudged and blurred with the repeated readings. The sheriff stopped bringing in extra deputies for search lines. The state investigators were reassigned to other cases with more pressing leads. The diner reopened fully, cleaning the booth where the Fosters last sat, but no one liked to sit there, claiming the seat felt cold even when the sun poured through the windows. The car remained in the sheriff's lot for a time before being released to Michael's parents, who did not have the heart to drive it back home. They hired a transport service to take it away in silence. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, the bulletin boards at local truck stops still held faded flyers with the children's faces. The edges curled and yellowed with time. The phone number at the bottom still worked, still answered by a deputy with a weary voice who wrote down each new tip but no longer believed any would lead to the family. Reporters who had once filled the diner parking lot with satellite trucks found other tragedies to cover. When they did return for an anniversary story, they interviewed locals who repeated the same questions as before. How could an entire family just disappear? How could no one see anything? Why did no one hear them call for help? The Fosters became part of local legend, a cautionary tale told at coffee counters and PTA meetings. Parents reminded their children to stay close on road trips, to keep the car doors locked, to never trust strangers. May's Junction kept the lights on but could never quite scrub the feeling of dread from its cracked tiles. Travelers who stopped late at night felt the cold wind slip through the doorway like a memory of something unfinished. The waitresses changed every year or two, but they all told the new hires the same story of the family who sat and ate and then left nothing behind but questions. By the second anniversary of the Fosters' disappearance, the case sat buried in a metal filing cabinet in the sheriff's office, marked with a single word in red marker across the front of the folder, "Cold." The family's pictures hung on a wall lined with other missing person posters, the edges curling as time sucked the color from their faces. But the case was not completely forgotten. In 2010, a newly appointed county investigator named Rachel Garrett pulled the file while reorganizing old records. She read each page, slowly taking notes on every lead that had died without explanation. She felt a dull ache as she studied the school photos of Emma and Ben smiling in clothes that would have long since been outgrown. She made a decision to open the file again, certain the original investigation had missed something in the fog of dead ends. She asked for the sheriff's permission to review all background information on the family, hoping that if there was a reason for them to run or someone to hunt them, it would be buried in their past. Michael Foster's records looked clean at first glance. He had paid his taxes, worked at a tire distribution warehouse in Denver before the move, and had no major debts in collections. But tucked in the manila envelope of his older documents was a faded photocopy of a sealed court case from 15 years earlier. Rachel squinted at the blurred lettering, reading it over and over. It detailed a single count of aggravated assault that had been dismissed after the victim refused to testify. The name of the victim was still legible: George Kramer. The report claimed Michael had punched Kramer outside a gambling den, breaking his nose. The charge had been dropped, but the two men had been barred from the premises. Rachel sat back in her chair, fingers drumming the desk. It was a small clue, an old crime from another life, but she wondered if grudges had longer memories than people realized. She wrote the name George Kramer on a new list titled Persons of Interest. Rachel Garrett began to track down George Kramer. She called county clerks, old landlords, and even a parole officer who had once checked on him for a drunk and disorderly charge. Eventually, she learned that Kramer had moved to a town only 50 miles east of Mays Junction in 2001, renting a small farmhouse on a dirt road that barely appeared on the map. Rachel found the old rental paperwork in a property office with peeling linoleum floors. She copied the address and drove there herself, bouncing over potholes and squinting into the lowering sun. The house was shuttered now, its siding gray with mildew and one window cracked like a spider web. Neighbors told her Kramer had lived there less than 2 years before, moving on, never talking much and never staying in one place long enough to make friends. Rachel felt something tighten in her chest as she thanked them politely and walked back to her car, her boots crunching dry weeds. Eventually, she tracked Kramer to a decaying duplex outside Wichita. When he opened the door, he looked older than his file photo suggested, with sunken eyes and stained fingers that shook as he lit a cigarette. Rachel explained she was reopening the case about the missing family, that his name had come up in old records. Kramer looked at her with tired suspicion, leaning against the doorframe like it was the only thing holding him up. He denied ever seeing Michael Foster again after the fight. He claimed he had no idea the family went missing, that he would have told the police if he had known anything. Rachel watched his eyes, looking for a flicker of guilt or surprise, but all she saw was weary irritation. He insisted he had moved on with his life, that he wanted nothing to do with anyone who brought trouble to his door. Rachel typed up a report on the interview and filed it with the new investigation notes. She checked Kramer's work history and found odd jobs, day labor, and no credit cards in use around the time of the Fosters' disappearance. She asked for a search warrant on the old farmhouse, but the district attorney declined, citing lack of probable cause after so many years. There was no proof Kramer had ever been near Mays Junction that night. Rachel understood the frustration, but could not shake the feeling that the past was reaching through the years to choke the truth. She included the Kramer connection in her presentation to the sheriff, who frowned and asked if she really believed a grudge from a bar fight 15 years earlier could motivate a crime like this. Rachel had no clear answer. The sheriff suggested they look deeper into Michael's recent life. Rachel contacted Michael's employer in Denver, who remembered him as reliable but distant. He had worked extra hours in the months before the move, claiming he wanted to save up for the long drive and costs of relocation. She called his bank and saw a steady pattern of small withdrawals and one larger payment to a moving company. Nothing indicated debts that might draw the wrong kind of attention. Friends described him as private but friendly. No one knew of anyone threatening him or following him. Sarah's family claimed she never mentioned fear of anyone from Michael's past. Rachel wrote all this down carefully, refusing to dismiss the old assault case even as she admitted to herself that nothing in Michael's adult life pointed to ongoing conflict with Kramer. Rachel decided to review the original case files one more time. She sat at the small metal table in the records room, breathing the dry smell of aging paper and felt-tip ink. She spread out crime scene photos of the diner's parking lot, the car with its keys in the ignition, the half-finished plates of food. She flipped through witness statements that talked about a quiet night, the hum of the jukebox, the tired faces of travelers waiting for coffee refills. She read the transcript from the waitress who remembered Michael looking distracted, maybe angry. She read the part where she said he seemed to nod at someone as he stood up. Rachel circled that line in red ink, tapping the pen against the paper. She wrote a single question in the margin. Who was he nodding at? Rachel Garrett closed the file on Michael's past and turned her focus to Sarah Foster, determined not to overlook anything. She sat at her desk with a yellow legal pad scribbling notes while the sheriff's office settled into its afternoon hush. She pulled Sarah's bank records and utility statements from storage, frowning at the numbers that lined up in neat columns. For the most part, they showed a family living within modest means their checking account balance rarely exceeding a few $100s. But one line item caught her eye. 2 months before they disappeared, Sarah had taken out a cash loan from a payday lender in Denver for $20,000. Rachel felt her pen stall on the paper. That was no small sum, especially for a family watching their budget. She wondered why the original investigators had overlooked it or written it off as unimportant. She underlined the entry twice and made a note to find the lender's office contact. When Rachel called the payday lender's office, she heard the shuffle of papers and the bored voice of a clerk reading off the old file. Sarah had come in by herself and signed for the loan with no cosigner promising to pay it back in regular installments. She had made 3 small payments before the family vanished, never missing one, suggesting she intended to keep the debt current. There was no mention of what she used the money for, and no law required the lender to ask. Rachel leaned back in her chair, thinking about the timing. It was close enough to the disappearance to matter. She imagined Sarah folding the cash and tucking it in a purse, keeping it secret even from Michael. It raised new questions about what was happening inside that marriage, the quiet tensions that might have led to a hurried exit or desperate act. Rachel reached out to Sarah's best friend, Karen Franklin, who still lived in Denver. She found her number in an old interview sheet and dialed it, waiting through 3 rings until Karen answered with suspicion in her voice. Rachel explained she was reopening the case, that she wanted to ask a few questions about Sarah. Karen sighed heavily, saying she had already told the police everything, but Rachel pressed gently, asking about the loan. Karen hesitated before admitting that Sarah had seemed worried in the weeks before they left. She remembered Sarah coming over late one night, shaking so hard she spilled wine on the couch. She had confessed she thought Michael was hiding something from her. He had been staying late at work, taking calls outside, turning away when she asked about money. Karen had told her to confront him, but Sarah had only nodded, her eyes glassy with fear or doubt. Rachel wrote it all down carefully, feeling the portrait of the Fosters shift in her mind. She pulled up Sarah's last emails, stored in evidence with the help of an IT technician. The messages were mostly routine plans with family questions about moving companies, but one line in an email to Karen stood out. Sarah had typed that she was considering leaving Michael, but she did not know where to go. She mentioned wanting to keep the kids safe, but there was no detail about what the threat was. Rachel underlined the words and rubbed her forehead. It suggested motive for running, but not for vanishing. She'd found no communication with divorce lawyers or social services. If Sarah was planning to leave, she had not left much of a trail. The payday loan company provided an address for the disbursement. Sarah had collected the cash in person and signed the receipt in tidy, careful letters. Rachel drove out to the strip mall where the office sat the neon sign flickering weakly in the cold wind. She stood in the parking lot, imagining Sarah here with her coat pulled tight, looking over her shoulder as she accepted an envelope of cash. Rachel felt the weight of the unspoken. Why did Sarah need that much money so quickly, and why keep it hidden? She spoke to the manager, who remembered nothing helpful about her. The surveillance footage had long been erased. Rachel walked back to her car, the sky lowering with heavy clouds, a cold certainty settling in her chest that secrets had buried this family long before the earth tried to. Rachel began to chart a timeline on her office wall with colored pins and string, trying to track every payment, every rumor, every contradiction. Sarah's family denied knowing about the loan. Michael's brother insisted Michael would never hit Sarah or threaten her. Rachel read back through transcripts where friends described Sarah as quiet, devoted to the kids, rarely arguing in public. But there was also the waitress at May's Junction, who had described Michael looking annoyed, rubbing his forehead as he tried to calm the kids. Small things added up to a picture of stress and frustration, not outright violence, but maybe enough to make someone consider escape. The sheriff came in quietly one afternoon to look over the timeline and left shaking his head, muttering about families and the secrets they kept. The more Rachel dug, the more convinced she became that Sarah was planning something, even if no one else had noticed. She tracked down a moving company in Denver that had given them an estimate for local service only. Sarah had told them they would be storing items short-term before finding a new place. Michael had not been present at the meeting. Rachel scribbled the detail down. She visited the storage unit they had rented, but it had been emptied by family years before, the contents a collection of toys and boxes of clothes, nothing to suggest a plan to flee or start over somewhere new. Rachel pressed her pen against her lips and considered the possibility that Sarah had been planning to take the kids and leave Michael entirely. At the end of another long day, Rachel sat alone in the sheriff's office, the only light the yellow glow of her desk lamp. She flipped back through the photos of the diner table with the abandoned plates. Sarah's purse sat open in one frame, her wallet inside with her ID but no cash. Rachel closed her eyes and pictured the cash from the loan. Was it in there that night? Had it been stolen? Had someone known she had it on her? She opened her eyes and jotted another note to check local crime reports for robberies or suspicious individuals passing through May's Junction that month. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Sarah had secrets. She had fear. She had a loan no one could explain. Rachel Garrett sat at her desk and reviewed the original witness statements, once again hoping to catch some detail that had been overlooked in the chaos of the first investigation. She read the words carefully, lips moving in silent repetition. One waitress had mentioned that the family seemed on edge, but polite. She had described Michael tapping his fingers on the table and checking the time repeatedly, while Sarah kept glancing at the bathroom hallway. Another customer remembered the kids fighting over a milkshake, their voices carrying in the quiet diner. Rachel underlined these observations, but paused at one statement that made her frown. A retired couple passing through Kansas that night had told deputies they saw the Fosters leave with another couple who offered to pay their bill. The details were vague, but the husband insisted he remembered a man in a dark jacket placing a hand on Michael's shoulder in a friendly gesture before they all walked out together. The problem was, the receipt from that night was missing from the diner's records. Rachel called the current owner of May's Junction and asked if old receipt books had ever been found. The owner sounded confused and said he had never seen them. She drove out to the diner and sat at the counter looking around the space that had barely changed in a decade. The cracked vinyl booths, the buzzing neon sign, and the stained coffee mugs remained the same. She spoke to the newest manager, who claimed he had heard about the missing family, but always thought it was just a small-town rumor. Rachel pressed him, asking about old storage spaces or boxes of records, but he just shrugged. The waitress on duty that night had moved away years earlier, leaving no forwarding address. Rachel stood in the middle of the diner and closed her eyes, imagining the scene that night. the family eating quietly while the jukebox played old country songs. The couple at the counter watching with polite curiosity. The other customers chewing slowly, paying more attention to their pie than the family in the corner. She tried to picture the other couple, the ones who supposedly paid the bill. They remained stubbornly faceless in her mind. She wondered if they had been locals who had simply forgotten, or if they had never wanted to be remembered. She opened her eyes and walked to the booth where the Fosters had eaten, placing her palm flat on the cool plastic. She felt no revelation, only the hollow silence that filled the room. Rachel decided to re-interview anyone she could find who had been there that night. She tracked down the retired couple who had reported seeing the Fosters with another pair. They now lived in a small house in Oklahoma. She called them and spoke with the wife who remembered little beyond the cold wind outside and the taste of the coffee. Her husband insisted again that someone had paid the bill for the Fosters. When Rachel pressed for details about the other couple's appearance, he became frustrated, claiming only that they seemed normal and friendly. He could not remember hair color, clothing, or even which direction they had left when they exited the diner. Rachel took notes quietly, fighting her disappointment. She next visited a man who had been a dishwasher at Mays Junction in 2001. He now worked at a different diner 2 towns over. When she slid into a booth across from him and pulled out her notepad, he looked away, his jaw tight. He said he had been busy cleaning dishes that night and had not seen much of anything. When Rachel pushed, he admitted the old owner had told them all to stop talking to police after the first few days because it hurt business. He had not wanted to lose his job, so he kept quiet. Rachel asked if he remembered anyone paying the bill for the Fosters. He hesitated before shaking his head slowly. He said he only remembered a woman crying in the bathroom when she realized the family had left without paying. Rachel made careful notes of every inconsistency. She wondered if the missing receipt page had been torn out deliberately or lost in the confusion of closing time. She asked the current owner about safe deposit boxes or old ledgers in storage, but he shook his head apologetically. He had bought the diner cheap after the scandal had driven customers away. He wanted nothing to do with the old rumors. Rachel sat in her car afterward, feeling the cold steering wheel under her palms. She knew that small towns remembered everything and nothing in equal measure. Rumor twisted facts until they became stories. Witnesses convinced themselves they had seen things that never happened. Others buried what they knew so they would not have to explain it. She added all of this to her growing wall of notes in the sheriff's office, drawing a thin red line between the missing receipt and the claim that another couple had paid. She wrote in block letters that someone might have wanted to erase proof the family had been there. She considered why. Had the other couple planned to take them away quietly? Had Sarah or Michael agreed to go willingly, thinking it was safer than making a scene? Rachel found herself staring at the school photos of Emma and Ben, their smiling faces oblivious to any danger. She remembered the waitress's words about the family leaving calmly, no panic, no shouting. That haunted her most of all. Rachel tried to match the timeline of the diner visit with calls to nearby gas stations and motels. She found nothing but the same gap of silence that had frustrated investigators for years. Cameras had been rare, and the few that existed had long since taped over anything useful. Credit card records were clean, no ATM withdrawals. The family car sat with its keys in the ignition like a gravestone. Rachel pressed her pen so hard against the paper she broke the tip, the ink smearing. She wrote down one last question in careful letters. Who wanted them to vanish so badly they erased even the receipt? Rachel Garrett sat at her desk late into the evening, staring at the scrawled timeline pinned to the wall. Strings, crisscrossed photographs, notes, and a battered map of the area around Mays Junction. She felt the weight of the missing receipt page and the blurred witness testimony. She decided it was time to dig deeper into the region's forgotten corners. She requested old motel registration logs from every establishment within a 50-mile radius of the diner, knowing it would mean hours of dry reading but determined not to overlook anything. She spread them across the conference table and began flipping through with steady patience, eyes scanning handwritten names, the neat columns of check-in dates, and cryptic initials from night clerks long gone. Halfway through the second day, she froze at the sight of a single entry scrawled in shaky cursive. The name Foster. It had been signed into a budget motel 27 miles east of Mays Junction on the very night the family disappeared. The register page was yellowed and brittle, but the date was unmistakable. She stared at the cheap ballpoint signature, wondering if Michael or Sarah had written it. The clerk who had taken the entry was listed only by initials. Rachel called the current manager, who sounded confused but cooperative. He confirmed they still had the old room keys in a rusted cabinet. She asked if the room had been remodeled or destroyed in the years since. He said it had been left vacant after an unpaid bill led to management shutting it down. Rachel drove out that afternoon, the wind sweeping over low fields as the road unspooled before her. The motel sat slumped at the edge of a county road, paint peeling from its doors, and the sign missing half its letters. She parked and walked slowly past silent rooms, finally stopping at the one from the ledger. The door stuck before opening with a hollow scrape revealing dim light through a cracked window. Dust hung in the air like fog. Rachel's flashlight beam cut across the old carpet, stained and curling at the edges. A sagging mattress lay crooked on the frame, its floral print yellowed with age. She stepped carefully, eyes scanning for anything that might have survived a decade of abandonment. Near the baseboard, she noticed something small and pale under a layer of grime. She knelt and brushed the dirt away with gloved fingers, revealing a child's sock, faded pink with a tiny cartoon rabbit printed on it. Her breath caught as she placed it in an evidence bag, fingers trembling. She thought of Emma Foster, 9 years old, and smiling from school photos. She forced herself to keep looking, moving methodically through the tiny bathroom with its cracked tiles and rust-stained sink. She found nothing else that definitively connected to the Fosters, but the sock was enough. She closed the door behind her, standing in the cold wind and staring at the darkening sky as the first hints of winter pressed close. Rachel brought the sock to the state lab. She filled out the chain of custody paperwork with a steady hand while her heart raced. The lab technicians promised to check for DNA despite the years that had passed. She left with the knowledge that evidence, however small, might finally speak. Days later, the call came confirming a match. The dried trace of blood on the sock belonged to Emma. Rachel closed her eyes at her desk as she listened, the words of confirmation ringing hollow. She thanked the technician and hung up, leaning forward to press her forehead against the scarred desktop. She felt an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a child who should have been safe. The sheriff came in and read the report silently, jaw tight. He exhaled through his nose and asked Rachel what she planned to do next. She said she wanted to find out if anyone remembered the family at the motel. They sent a deputy to knock on doors of the houses that dotted the county road. Most people claimed they had no memory of who stayed at the rundown place back then. One elderly neighbor said he recalled seeing a station wagon in the parking lot late that night, but could not describe anyone inside. Another man said the lights had been on in the room for hours, but had gone out suddenly around midnight. Rachel wrote it all down, building the flimsiest outline of a timeline in her head. Rachel turned her attention to the motel owner who had run the place in 2001. He now lived in a retirement home 2 counties over. She visited him in a cramped room with faded curtains, sitting on a squeaky plastic chair as he struggled to remember details. He squinted at her notes and muttered about people skipping out on their bills, saying it happened too often to track. When she pressed about the Foster signature, he shrugged. He remembered someone using the name, but could not say if it was the family or someone pretending to be them. He spoke of transients, oil field workers, and strangers who passed through with cash and no ID. Rachel left frustrated but understanding that time eroded memories as thoroughly as it erased footprints. She returned to the sheriff's office and pinned the motel room photo next to the diner picture on her board. She drew a line connecting them with a red marker. She labeled the sock with Emma's name and date of birth. She sat staring at the evidence wall, trying to push away the thought of a frightened child in a cold room of parents exhausted and whispering plans. She wondered if they had hidden there voluntarily, hoping to avoid someone who threatened them, or if they had been forced there at gunpoint, eyes wide with fear as they obeyed silent orders. Rachel felt anger boiling under her skin at the idea of anyone holding children hostage in a forgotten roadside motel. In the days that followed, she called every surviving deputy who had worked the case in 2001. Some answered with surprise that anyone still cared. Others admitted they barely remembered details beyond the endless fields and dead-end interviews. Rachel pressed them to recall any mention of the motel, but none could confirm checking it back then. It had simply fallen through the cracks, another sad oversight in a case that had gone cold far too quickly. She wrote that down, too, refusing to let anyone forget the truth of that failure. Rachel Garrett sat in the dim records room with her head in her hands. She felt the stale air press against her skin as she went over every note and photograph. The motel evidence had shaken her, the blood-stained sock burned in her memory like a brand. She had begun to think there was nothing left to find. The case felt like a house with all its doors closed and locked. She had pulled every file box marked with the Foster name, digging through folders yellowed with age. As she sifted the brittle papers, her fingers brushed the edge of a plastic case wedged at the bottom of the drawer. She pulled it out slowly. It was a VHS tape labeled in faded marker with the words, Mays Junction, 11-1701. She turned it in her hands, heart picking up its pace. No one had logged this tape in the evidence inventory. Rachel brought the tape to an old player stored in the break room closet. She cleaned the heads with a Q-tip dipped in alcohol, remembering long nights of watching movies as a teenager. She pressed the tape into the machine with deliberate care. The sheriff walked in behind her, curious despite himself, and sat at the small table with a styrofoam cup of coffee. The machine whirred and clicked static, filling the old television screen before the grainy black-and-white footage resolved into the familiar interior of Mays Junction. The camera was mounted high in a corner, capturing the cash register and the dining area beyond. Rachel watched the blurry shapes move about, frozen by the certainty that she was seeing the night the family had vanished. The clock on the screen read just past 7 in the evening. Customers came and went with slow Midwestern patience. The camera caught the Foster family sitting in a corner booth. Michael leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Sarah shifted restlessly, glancing toward the bathroom. Emma and Ben argued over their milkshake. Rachel watched Michael stand up and walk away, Ben sliding after him with the unthinking loyalty of a child. Sarah and Emma followed a moment later. The booth sat empty for a long minute before a figure approached from the edge of the frame. Rachel leaned in heart-hammering as the tape showed 2 other people stepping up to the booth. The 2 strangers wore heavy jackets with patches that looked like law enforcement insignia. They were grainy shapes, but unmistakable in their purpose. One rested a hand on the table, appearing to examine the contents left behind. The other turned toward the door as if watching for something. Rachel felt the sheriff sit up beside her, his cup forgotten. The tape continued in silent accusation. A moment later, the Foster family reappeared on screen, walking with those 2 figures. There was no struggle. No one shouted. The kids looked subdued. Heads lowered. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. The group walked calmly out the door, the bell above it swinging with hollow cheer. The camera angle did not follow them into the parking lot. Rachel paused the tape and sat back. Her mouth felt dry. The sheriff exhaled, cursing softly under his breath before falling silent. They replayed it 3 more times, watching the shadows and movements, analyzing every small gesture. Rachel scribbled notes, circling the patches on the jackets. She asked the sheriff if anyone had checked the local department's rosters from that night. He shook his head slowly. They had assumed no law enforcement was involved, dismissing the idea as too unbelievable. Rachel felt cold work its way up her spine. She wrote it in capital letters on her pad. Deputies or impersonators. They spent the next day reviewing employment records from the county sheriff's department. Rachel requested the rosters for the month around the disappearance, cross-referencing them with disciplinary notes and resignations. 2 names appeared that made her pen freeze. Both had resigned within a month of the Fosters' vanishing. One had left citing personal reasons and moved out of state. The other had died in a car crash 5 years earlier. Rachel circled both names and drew arrows between them and the tape's blurry images. She showed the notes to the sheriff, who sat heavily in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. Rachel called the personnel office to request full files on the 2 men. She read through them slowly in the silence of the records room. The files were thin. They had minor infractions, lateness, occasional attitude problems. One had been reprimanded for losing evidence in another case. There was nothing that screamed murder or abduction. Rachel set the folders down carefully and leaned back in her chair. She felt her heart beating against her ribs, knowing it was a thin line between suspicion and proof. She decided she would need to speak to the families of both men, no matter how awkward or painful it would be. She started with the man who had died in the car crash. His widow lived in a small bungalow outside of town surrounded by wind-bent trees. She invited Rachel in politely, but sat stiffly on the edge of her couch as she asked her questions. The woman claimed she remembered that month well. Her husband had come home quiet and tense most nights. He drank more heavily than usual. He would not tell her why. One night, he said he was thinking of quitting, but she thought it was just the stress of the job. When Rachel asked about the patch on his jacket, the woman looked confused. She said he never talked about special assignments or odd jobs. She started to cry quietly, pressing a tissue to her mouth. Rachel left with apologies, feeling both guilty and unsatisfied. The second man was harder to trace. He had moved to Mexico years ago. Rachel spent days tracking down contact numbers, leaving messages that went unreturned. She felt the case slipping through her fingers like sand. She updated the sheriff each morning with tired eyes, listing her calls and emails in precise detail. The sheriff said little, only nodding with grim acknowledgement. They both knew time was against them. Witnesses forgot. Records faded, evidence decayed. But Rachel refused to stop. She pinned the blurry images from the tape on her board, drawing thick red lines to the deputies' names. She underlined a single question 3 times. Why did they leave with the family so calmly? Rachel Garrett sat in the quiet office long after sunset, the overhead lights casting a dull glow across stacks of paper and pinned photographs. She stared at the grainy surveillance stills taped to the wall. 2 men in law enforcement jackets flanking the Foster family as they exited May's Junction calmly. The image burned in her mind. She had spent days trying to match the blurry outlines with the old personnel files, the names of the 2 deputies who had left the department so abruptly that winter. She read their disciplinary reports over and over, noting minor infractions that seemed harmless on the surface, but hinted at a pattern of disregard for procedure. Rachel felt the weight of their unremarkable careers ending in sudden departures, one fatal in a car crash and the other disappearing over the border. She compiled every note she had on them, building profiles from fragmented records. Both men had worked together on patrol shifts overlapping on multiple nights, including the evening the Fosters vanished. She found duty rosters with penciled edits and a single-line reading shift swapped, scrawled in the margin. No one had ever asked why. Rachel wrote the phrase in block letters at the top of her page. She cross-checked the logs with the dates of their resignations only weeks after the Fosters were reported missing. The timing felt too perfect to ignore. She lifted the photos again, squinting at the patches on the jackets. They matched the department's old design exactly down to the shape of the lettering. Rachel brought her findings to the sheriff the next morning. She laid out the files in careful rows across his desk. He studied them in silence, jaw set tight, the lines in his face deepening with each new page. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. He said their department had never officially investigated its own people back then. Everyone had assumed no deputy would do something so vile, especially in uniform. Rachel held his gaze and said they could not afford to assume anything now. She asked permission to interview surviving staff from that year. The sheriff hesitated but finally nodded, telling her to proceed carefully. She began with the oldest retired deputies still in town. She sat on worn couches in living rooms filled with family photos asking about those two men. Most claimed vague memories of them being quiet, sometimes unreliable, but nothing that set off alarm bells. One older deputy recalled a heated argument in the locker room about money. He said he remembered hearing the phrase payoff and told them both to knock it off. Rachel underlined that word 3 times in her notebook. She asked if anyone had seen the two men outside of work, but most just shrugged. They were not the type to socialize much, preferring quiet drinks at the edge of town where no one paid close attention. Rachel drove to one of those bars, its neon sign flickering over an empty lot. She sat at the counter with a coffee, speaking to the bartender who had worked there for decades. The man squinted at her notes and frowned. He remembered them drinking together late at night, sometimes heads bent close in private conversation. He thought they might have been planning something but could not say what. He claimed one had asked once about selling his old hunting rifle but never followed through. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes on every stray detail. She felt the old anger in the bartender's voice as he talked about police who thought they could get away with anything. Rachel returned to the department and pulled the disciplinary logs from the year after the Fosters vanished. She found quiet purges of old files, small gaps in the logs that suggested missing paperwork. She asked the sheriff about it. He looked tired, eyes shadowed with regret. He admitted that during those years the department had no formal system for preserving records. Things had gone missing. Evidence rooms had been cleaned out. Rachel felt sick thinking about what might have been lost forever and what had been hidden deliberately. She knew it would be impossible to prove after so long, but she could not let it rest. She made calls to state investigators who had worked the original case. Most were retired or dead. One old agent in Arizona remembered the night well. He said he had always thought there was something off about the local department's cooperation. They had been polite but slow to turn over records citing bureaucracy. He remembered suspecting the case might involve local players, but he had no jurisdiction to push harder. Rachel thanked him and sat back with the phone resting in her lap. She had felt her chest tighten at how close the truth had been, only to slip away in the cracks of jurisdiction and professional courtesy. Rachel returned to her board and rearranged the photos, drawing new lines between the men's resignation dates, the surveillance footage, and the motel register. She sat for hours staring at it, piecing together the shape of something monstrous. The two men had planned something. They had taken the family calmly in full view, using the authority of their uniforms to quiet any suspicion. They had driven them away into the dark, leaving behind a car with keys in the ignition and a purse with no cash. They had known the roads, the motels. No one checked the places they could hide for a night or more. Rachel closed her eyes and saw the Fosters in the back of a cruiser, kids asleep on their mother's lap, thinking they would be safe. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, listening to the wind batter the windows. She thought about the weight of a badge and how easy it was to turn trust into terror. She thought about Emma's sock on the motel floor, the bloodstain too old to tell its story fully. She wrote out a list of every surviving deputy who might have heard rumors or known more than they admitted. She resolved to call them all. The sheriff offered quiet support, but warned her that no one would want to talk. Rachel understood. She would keep pushing anyway. Rachel Garrett arrived at the sheriff's office early, setting her coffee down on the scarred wooden table with deliberate care. She flipped open her notebook and read through the list of properties once owned or rented by the two deputies who had appeared on the surveillance tape. The names glared at her in thick black ink. She called the county records clerk and asked for deeds, lease agreements, and tax statements, anything that might reveal where the men had spent their time away from official eyes. The clerk sounded bemused at the request for records so old, but promised to dig through the files. Rachel hung up and tapped her pen against the table, mind racing with possibilities. She wrote down every rural address tied to either man. One address stood out because of its isolation. It was a small farmhouse with a few acres of scrubland listed under one of the deputy's names for less than 2 years before being sold quickly after his resignation. Rachel studied the faded black and white tax photo of the place. It looked tired and slumped, a roof patched with mismatched shingles and a chimney leaning like it was drunk. She pulled county aerial maps and traced the dirt road leading there, noting the absence of neighbors for nearly a mile in every direction. She felt her pulse climb with cold certainty that someone would choose a spot like that if they wanted privacy. Rachel and the sheriff drove out together on a gray morning, the air heavy with the promise of snow. The old property had since changed hands twice, its current owner a retired mechanic who met them at the gate with a suspicious frown. He agreed to let them look around, but insisted he had nothing to hide. Rachel walked slowly through the overgrown yard boots, crunching frost-brittle weeds. The house had been partly renovated, new windows glaring bright against the peeling clapboard. She stepped onto the back porch and felt the sagging wood shift beneath her weight. She opened the door to a hallway lined with mismatched wallpaper, the smell of mildew clinging stubbornly in the corners. The owner followed behind, explaining he had found plenty of junk when he bought the place, but had cleared it all out. Rachel asked if there was a cellar. He nodded and led them to a hatch in the kitchen floor. The hinges groaned as he lifted it. A rickety wooden staircase descended into darkness. Rachel clicked on her flashlight and felt her heart beat in her throat. She went down carefully, one step at a time, the beam catching rough stone walls and shelves stacked with old canning jars covered in dust. The air felt 10 degrees colder, heavy with trapped moisture and old earth. She swept the light across the dirt floor, pausing when she saw something irregular in the packed soil. She knelt and brushed at the dirt with gloved fingers. Faint lines emerged, drawn crudely into the dust. Letters shakily carved, some overlapping. She squinted and read the first name, Emma. A few feet away was Ben's name, smaller and barely legible. Her breath fogged in the cold air. The sheriff muttered under his breath, but said nothing else. Rachel's light picked out other details. Scraps of fabric half buried in the dirt, faded colors that might have been parts of Sarah's clothing. She bagged them, carefully labeling each with trembling hands. She forced herself to search every corner of that low-ceilinged space, finding other scrawls on the wall where children might have sat with their backs pressed against the cold stone. She felt the ache in her chest as she imagined them waiting. Back in the daylight, Rachel's hands shook as she signed the chain of custody forms. She watched deputies tape off the entrance to the cellar, the property owner standing to one side with wide eyes and silent horror. The sheriff told them they would need to search the entire grounds. The man just nodded numbly. Rachel leaned against the patrol car, breathing slowly, watching frost creep along the edges of the windshield. She felt like she had finally ripped open a wound that had been festering for nearly a decade. She wrote everything in her notebook with clinical precision, even though her vision blurred. The next day, crime scene technicians returned with ground-penetrating radar and shovels. They worked in grim silence as they mapped the cellar and its surroundings. Rachel stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest, refusing to look away as they dug. At one corner of the cellar floor, they hit disturbed soil. The coroner's van idled in the driveway, exhaust rising like ghostly breath in the frigid air. Rachel heard the quiet commands, the shuffle of boots, the rattle of equipment. When they uncovered the first bone, yellowed and brittle with age, she closed her eyes for a moment before opening them again, forcing herself to watch. In the following hours, they recovered fragments of 4 separate human remains. A small femur that could only belong to a child. A cracked adult skull with old damage. Rachel took notes with steady hands, her breath fogging in the cold. The sheriff stood beside her, face pale. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When the coroner confirmed the number of victims matched the missing family, Rachel turned away and pressed her fist against her mouth to stop the sound she felt rising in her chest. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and went back to work. In the days that followed, the crime lab confirmed clothing fibers matching what the Fosters had worn at the diner. DNA testing began on the bones. Rachel sat in her office with a phone pressed to her ear for hours each day, coordinating with state investigators and forensic experts. She dictated reports with a flat voice, refusing to allow emotion to leak through. At night, she sat in her car in the department lot engine off, staring at the lights of town and feeling the weight of every name on the board behind her desk. She knew the case had cracked open, but nothing about it felt like victory. Rachel Garrett arrived at the station before sunrise with a thermos of coffee clutched in both hands and a stack of files under her arm. She had barely slept since the cellar search, her thoughts crowded with images of the carved names in dirt and the small bones lifted carefully from shallow earth. She set the files on her desk and rested her forehead against the cool metal edge for a moment, forcing herself to breathe slowly. The evidence had spoken louder than any witness ever had. The family had not simply vanished. They had been taken hidden and killed in silence. The truth had waited, buried for nearly a decade, patient and patient as time allowed memories to dull and guilt to fester. The sheriff walked in with slow, heavy steps, looking older than Rachel remembered. He pulled up a chair across from her desk and sat down without a word for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady. He said he had been sheriff for 15 years and had believed in his people and their sense of duty. He admitted that he had once thought no one who wore the badge would do something so monstrous. Rachel listened without interrupting, her pen motionless on the page. She watched his hands tremble slightly as he picked at a fraying seam on his jacket. He spoke of community pride and the need to trust one another. She heard the regret in every word. Rachel turned away from him and looked at the evidence board covering one wall of the office. Photographs of the family in happier days had been pinned beside shots of the diner booth, the blood-stained sock from the motel, the cellar floor with names drawn in weak fingers. Lines of red marker linked them all in a jagged web of cause and effect, a map of betrayal and suffering. She studied the faces of the children, frozen in time, unaware of the future waiting for them beyond that final road trip. She felt her throat tighten with a grief she tried to control. She had seen too many victims over the years, but this case had burrowed into her bones in a way none ever had. Word of the discovery spread quickly once the coroner confirmed the remains matched the Fosters. Local news crews parked outside the department for days, their bright lights washing over deputies with drawn faces. Reporters pressed for interviews, asking how such horror could go unnoticed for so long. Rachel declined every request, focusing instead on finalizing reports and coordinating with state investigators. She called the surviving family members and spoke in quiet, measured tones, explaining what they had found, answering their broken questions with as much honesty as she could. On the other end of the line, she heard sobbing, anger, and silence that felt like accusation. She wrote everything down in her notes, refusing to forget even the hardest moments. The department's phone lines rang constantly as old tips resurfaced and new rumors spread. Rachel and the sheriff reviewed every call, checking old notes, rejecting wild theories. They knew now what had happened. They just needed to prove the final pieces. She returned again to the files of the two former deputies whose faces loomed over her investigation. One was dead in a crash that had killed no one else. His car had slammed into a tree on a rainy night, leaving behind a widow who remembered only his silence in the weeks before he resigned. The other had vanished into Mexico with no forwarding address, no phone number, no desire to be found. Rachel knew she needed more than suspicion. She needed testimony. She returned to interviewing retired deputies, some reluctant and some defensive, pressing them to remember anything about those weeks. She sat in dark living rooms with old men who remembered locker room jokes and unexplained cash sharing details they had once thought meaningless. She heard one say he had been told to forget he saw the men meeting late at the station on their night off. Another recalled a conversation about needing to pay someone off for quiet. Rachel wrote every word down her pen, scratching paper until her fingers cramped. Finally, one retired dispatcher agreed to meet her in person at a diner on the edge of town. The woman sat with shaking hands wrapped around a coffee cup, eyes darting to the door each time it opened. She confessed she had seen the two deputies bring the Fosters into the station late that night. She remembered the family looking confused but unafraid. She said she had seen the children huddled against Sarah, while Michael argued in low, furious tones with one of the deputies. She'd asked if she should log them in as visitors or detainees and had been told sharply to stay out of it. She had kept her head down because she was scared. Rachel listened without judgment, letting the silence stretch until the woman finished her story in tears. Rachel documented the confession in precise detail, signing the statement with the woman in the cold light of day. She filed it with the district attorney who had followed the investigation closely since the cellar was uncovered. Together, they planned the press conference that would finally acknowledge the truth. Rachel stood at the back of the crowd as the sheriff spoke into the microphones. He explained what they had found, how the family had been betrayed by men they should have trusted, and how the department had failed to see the danger in their own ranks. He spoke of reforms and regret. He answered angry questions from the press with calm resignation. Rachel watched his face, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. When the press conference ended, Rachel walked back to the empty station. She went to the evidence room and sat in a plastic chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She pulled the files into her lap and flipped through them slowly. She read the notes from her first days on the case, the scrawled questions she had written in the margins. She saw her own handwriting growing sharper, more desperate as the investigation deepened. She closed her eyes and tried to picture the Fosters at the diner one last time before anyone knew what would happen before trust was used as a weapon. She whispered their names under her breath and let the silence of the room swallow the sound. In the months that followed, the county dedicated a small memorial in a park not far from Mays Junction. It was a simple stone marker engraved with the family's names and dates set among low flowers that local volunteers tended. Rachel went once, standing alone in the early morning. She watched wind move through the grass and listened to birds calling from the trees. She read the names, slowly feeling their weight. She closed her eyes and promised she would not forget them, even if the world moved on and found new tragedies to watch. Rachel continued working in the department, helping to train new deputies on procedures meant to prevent such failures from ever happening again. She insisted on transparency and accountability, pushing against old habits of silence and deference. She spoke at meetings with a steady voice, reminding everyone of what they had lost when they turned away from questions that felt too uncomfortable. She carried the photographs of the family in her wallet, creased and worn with time. When recruits asked her why she was so strict, she told them the story in careful detail, making sure they understood trust could be the sharpest blade if held by the wrong hands. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more true crime narratives and in-depth mysteries. Let us know in the comments what you think about this case and tell us where you are watching from. Your thoughts and feedback help us keep bringing you more compelling stories.